Good morning. We are here to unpack the Trump-Xi summit, what really happened, what did not happen, what both sides want to think happened, and what may actually matter from now through the next 12 months or 24 months. President Trump is touting this summit as historic. Beijing is also positioning it at the start of a new concept of bilateral relations, this constructive, strategic stability, new framing, what a mouthful. But I think, people in this room have lived through enough new eras, resets in US-China relations to know that most of these so-called resets age pretty badly. So is this one going to be the exception, or should we be more modest in our exception, in our expectation? And this question, how to manage strategic rivalry competition without sleepwalking into crisis, conflict, or war is really at the heart of a lot of what we do here at Asian Society. For example, at CCA, our mission is to understand China from the inside out and to help leaders navigate shared futures. By sort of providing more clarity and discipline. And together with the outstanding work of our Center on US-China Relations, China File, Asia Society Policy Institute, we have built what I think is fair to call one of the largest and most important China houses in the United States, with much more still to do, of course. So Kevin, let me just start with you. What does it mean, constructive managed stability?
Well, thanks, Lizzie. Good to be here with the rest of the Asia Society team as we try to make sense of the Trump-Xi Jinping summit. 4 or 5 quick points in this quick round. First, on the framing of the relationship. Framing matters in China, and to some extent it matters in the United States. The previous frame for the US relationship from Beijing's perspective was Shuangying, win-win. That never really worked either in China or elsewhere in the world, because when people heard win-win, around the rest of the world, we interpreted that as China wins and then China wins. So this was not seen as being a realistic reflection of the actual substantive nature of the deeply competitive relationship between China and the United States across all the matrices of power. The fact, therefore, that Xi Jinping and the entire Chinese system used the Trump summit to change the framework, the framing of the relationship, is therefore, I think, consequential. As for the term which is used, which is constructive strategic stability, my best way of interpreting it is as follows. A, what Xi Jinping is saying through that is that there are critical strategic red lines, most particularly on Taiwan, which must be navigated carefully. If they're not, they're dangerous. And if it becomes too dangerous, it results in collision and conflict. The language used by Xi Jinping and the articulation of that was, in my judgment, stronger than we've seen before. The second component of this new constructive strategic stability frame is competition which is managed between the two countries within defined limits. And that is very much compatible with what we've argued for some time about a core component of the economic and technological competition in trade and investment and technology and artificial intelligence and the rest, where the two sides are engaged in a competitive race, but a competitive race which does not become kinetic and a competitive race which remains within defined boundaries. And the final component of this constructive strategic stability concept, when you look at it, is still creating the public political and private political and diplomatic space for these two countries to collaborate in areas of global public health and in other domains as well. And most significantly, in my view, the beginnings of a crack of light on the possibility of navigating some guardrails between the two on the most dislocating, dangerous and disturbing AI models to emerge, triggered by the recent innovations by Anthropic over the Mythos model. That's therefore the framework. It's something I think that the United States has indicated through their fact sheet after the summit that President Trump accepts as a framework as well, which is surprising. But that, therefore, we should look at, because in the Chinese system, new frameworks therefore inform different policy and behavioral postures by the rest of the Chinese system. Back to you, Lizzie.
Fantastic point. Thank you so much, Kevin. Orville, turning to you.
I think, Kevin, you've done a good job at sort of framing the framework, which I think I view as important. Also, I think the other element that struck me being there in Beijing during the summit was that Trump did try very hard to accord Xi Jinping the kind of respect that I think he is constantly sort of asking for. And I think that was essential if you're going to construct a new framework. However, I think the framework that they aspired to reconstructing is really only very aspirational. As I left, which was a day and a half after Trump, I went to the airport, looked out the window after I checked in, and there in the distance on the tarmac, I saw this giant droop-winged Aleutian transport plane that had just arrived. And of course, this was the advance plane for Putin, who was arriving right on the heels of Trump. And I think that said an awful lot about the fact that this wasn't some major new breakthrough that Trump and Xi had accomplished, but that there were verities of this relationship, many, many contradictions that they had not even touched upon. And of course, one of them was China's relationship with Russia, the war in Ukraine, and all of the amplifications that had on the rest of the relationship. So I think, there was a lot of very friendly talk, particularly from Trump, who made a huge effort. And at some point, I think points were almost embarrassing in his sort of flattery, but actually did it bend the metal? That, for me, is the real question. Because when it comes down to all the things that divides the country, those have to be resolved. And in order to resolve those contentious issues, someone has to give a little to get a little. And actually, one did not see a lot of that yet. It could follow, but I think the opportunity was missed to express more than an aspiration for a new kind of framework.
Fantastic. Thank you, Orville. And on Putin's visit and also Xi's upcoming visit to North Korea, Danny will make sure to ask your insights on those in our second round of Insights Take. But Danny, your quick take on the, sort of your headline takeaway from the summit.
Thanks, Lizzie. And it's great to be with all my ASPI colleagues and have Kevin back in the fold. So I'm inclined to see the summit as one skirmish in an extended struggle that's playing out over time. They extended their tactical pause, but we shouldn't confuse that with stability. Stalemate is not the same thing as stability. And if anything, the underlying strategic rivalry, I think, is intensifying. Second, for me, the idea that putting a utopian label like constructive strategic stability on the relationship is really going to change behavior is frankly wishful thinking. It looks good on a coffee mug, on a banner over a highway. If you read Wang Yi's commentary, it's heartwarming, but neither Washington nor Beijing are going to let this, as Orville said, aspirational slogan get in the way of the brass knuckle ongoing power contest between them. Third, I'd flag the significant inconsistencies between the readouts, which I think undercut the claim of any kind of strategic consensus between the leaders. And the last thing I'd point out is that, the big advantage that ASPI has in doing this program about a week after the summit is that so many more clues have come out about what did or didn't happen behind closed doors. And just as an example, President Trump's comments on Air Force One about Taiwan after he left China, frankly, told us more than the Chinese readout or the White House fact sheet. We learned that the president accepted Beijing storyline that the problem is Lai Jingde. He was a dangerous provocateur, is trying to go independent, wants to start a war with China. We got confirmation from the president himself that arms sales to Taiwan are really good negotiating chips to use with Beijing, and that whether he authorizes this arms package or not depends on China. Third, he announced 2 times that he's going to speak to Lai Jingde, the president of Taiwan. Like, that is a forehead slapper. And, what can I say other than it really speaks volumes about, let's say, the lack of rigor or substantive preparation on policy. So I think we really have to keep watching. This is an unfolding story.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Danny. And Jing, your view from China.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think this is a wonderful way to unpack this and to build on what my good colleagues has touched on. Maybe 2 or 3 points. One, I think Danny already alluded to, there's multiple US and multiple China we're looking at, given a lot of unpacked clues. So one thing is that there's China that focus on Taiwan, there's China focus on political stability, there's China focus on trade and technology. So there's multiple China we should be looking at. There's also multiple United States. China has been unpacking this MAGA US, there's US that is close with President Trump. There's also a US that is more established. So we should look at multitudes. That's, I think, a key takeaway for me. A second one is to build on the Kevin's good point from the beginning. I think the symmetry is really more about building trust. It's less about building trust, but more about building a floor to try to stabilize with a new framework. And there's a political drive behind both of that. I think, again, to look from inside out, as you said earlier, Lizzie, for Beijing, stability means to project some predictability towards 21st Party's Congress, which is going all the way to 2027, which President Xi really needs. And I think for President Trump, I think the September visit is one of the key deliverables for him. So even though there's very limited deliverables for this symmetry, maybe more has been saved for September, which for his political calendar, much closer to the midterm. Therefore, a lot of things I think might be by design to save for September. And the last takeaway for me is how personalized diplomacy has become for US and China. How many praises President Trump has been given to both President Xi to China, and how many personalized elements China has been put into this symmetry, the YMCAs and many other things. The leader-to-leader diplomacy has been increasingly consequential to the US-China relationship. Speaking of which, what we will be watching is how this can then be translated into whether there could be sustainable mechanism to translate some of this friendship into deliverables in econ tech and into health, which is listed as number 2 in the so-called Y list between collaboration between US and China.
Fantastic. And Wendy, finally, I will ask you to close out this first round with your trade and economic lens.
It's a bit tough to add anything to what my colleagues have said, but I do have a few things. Number one, on the framing, I would just point out that in the US fact sheet, while they seem to buy into this constructive strategic stability, they add a couple of other words. They say based on reciprocity and fairness. And so in some ways, I think this new framing kind of includes so much that I'm not really sure what exactly it means for each side going forward. Second, what also really struck me here was the overall kind of weak deliverables. And Jing makes a good point. The 2 leaders could be meeting up to 3 more times this year, including a crucial visit by potential visit by Xi Jinping in September to the United States. So they do have additional time to announce deliverables and to build on them. But again, very few deliverables. And my other comment would be, particularly economic side, if there was any doubt, we have clearly moved into a transactional world on the econ side versus trying to make structural changes and to press China to open and reform and get rid of its regulatory barriers. And we'll talk more about the deliverables, but I think that really struck me, particularly when you compare this visit to Trump's interaction with China during his first term, where he concluded the phase one deal, which was full of efforts by the United States to encourage structural changes in the Chinese economy.
Fantastic. Well, Wendy, let me actually just stay with you for a moment. I think you very importantly point out that there's an actual wrinkle in the White House side of the statement. There's this additional term on, reciprocity. Trade is really where rubber meets the road in this relationship, and a lot of the trade grievances really is built around this lack of reciprocity. So I wanted to ask your insight on this. After the summit, what should we actually be watching? What would count as a real deliverable at this stage between now and September? Is it tariff relief? Are we going to see any movement on investment restrictions? What about export control? What about market access? Are we looking at something entirely differently? Your insights on this.
So of all the economic deliverables, the one I'm really going to be looking at in terms of what it produces between now and September will be this newly established Board of Trade. Again, I think both sides are describing it a bit differently, and there's no kind of agreed upon mandate. The US talks about managing trade. China talks about engagement and dealing with problems, market access problems, whatever. But there seems that both sides are coalescing around an effort to reduce or eliminate tariffs on a bucket of about $30 billion worth of trade in non-sensitive sectors and products. Now, that's a big mouthful, but I think this is something that Greer and MOFCOM is talking about. And so I suspect that we may see this package go forward and be implemented even before the September summit. So that's number one. But number two is what will happen to the other tariffs? And we don't know. There's no indication that the US made any commitment not to hit China with additional 301 tariffs based on the investigations that are underway. But we also know that China very much expects the United States not to increase tariffs, or it's going, to impose countermeasures, which to me is the code word of, remember, we've got a lot of leverage over you, Washington, with respect to critical minerals and magnets. So in many ways, we are in a bit of a stalemate. Ambassador Greer points to the substantial decrease in the US-China bilateral deficit. But what he doesn't mention is the increase in our bilateral trade deficits with other countries, particularly in the region and particularly countries where Chinese companies are investing. So this relationship is getting a lot more complicated. And in many ways, I don't think the trade back and forth between China necessarily will be played out in those two countries. I think what I'll be watching is what happens in third countries right now.
Fantastic. Wendy, just a follow-up question. In addition to the Board of Trade, there's also the Board of Investment, which sounds more nebulous. What do we make of it? I don't think similar things have existed. I'm not sure how the legal authority stature jibe with CFIUS's existing investment scrutiny mechanisms. What kind of deals or negotiations could potentially emerge in the coming months? And what is this whole idea of board investment?
I think that's a great question. And when you read the fact sheet, the US fact sheet, it's a board to discuss investment issues. So what that really means, who knows? I think that there's a real split in the president's cabinet about, should we welcome more Chinese investment? Should we keep it out? And I think Congress has a very strong view here on a bipartisan basis, and that's leaning more to keeping it out. And frankly, I'm not even sure that China is looking to invest lots in the United States in fear that this may lead to the US gaining some leverage over them. We'll have to see how this shakes out. What I suspect we'll see is the announcement of some very discrete investment tie-up deals between US and Chinese companies. but on a limited basis and not necessarily greenfield investment either, different tie-ups between companies, licensing arrangements, or joint ventures. But I'm not expecting a lot on this front because I think, as you mentioned, Lizzie, there's just so many restrictions in the United States. And again, I don't think public opinion is behind welcoming massive Chinese investment to the shores of the United States.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Wendy. And talking about Beijing's motivation, Beijing's sort of incentives going into the summit. Jing, let's just go inside Xi Jinping's head a little bit. As we discussed, I think related to Board of Investment, China comes to this summit with both strength and anxiety, I think, it's manufacturing strength, tech momentum, but it's also dealing with weak domestic demand, overcapacity trade tension related issues, deflationary local physical stress, and this private sector very innovative. But, as we wrote about in our Center for China analysis work, the private sentiment is pretty low. So Jing, how does that domestic mix shape Xi Jinping's approach to Trump? What is Beijing looking for this time?
Thank you, Lizzie. I'll leave the interpretation of the leader's mind to our leader, who had a wonderful book on the leader, Xi Jinping. I will try to explain what I understand from China's perspective. And I think Wendy laid out a very good framework of both sides is actually trying to project its own image a little bit rather than reaching too many consensus. Although there's some consensus be reached, such as the framework as we just talked about. I think Beijing was trying to project at least three images as I see from this summitry for its own reasons. Number one, as almost all has mentioned, Beijing wants to project some stability, at least to project itself as a stabilizer of the US-China relationship. Beijing now has recognized, I think, competition is not going to disappear, but it wants competition to be managed, to be within bounds. Given the domestic reasons you have just alluded to, Lizzie, it faced some domestic economic challenge. It wants to advance its own technology. It's not really a declaration of that this is a relationship that will return to normalization, but it wants to be within controlled parameters. So this is number one. I think Beijing wants managed competition and predictable future for this. Number two is, I think Orville alluded to this, Putin has arrived when President Trump has just departed. Beijing wants to project, I think, centrality. Beijing wants to show that it is still approaching the center of the global stage. Within a short period of time in 2026, Beijing has hosted leaders from France, United Kingdom, United States, and Russia. There's a narrative emerging in China. All P5 of the United Nations Security Council are gathered in Beijing, and many more are coming, right? That symbolism really matter, and for domestic and international audience. And the messages are simple in my mind. For domestic audience, we're doing very well in China. And the world is getting increasingly chaotic. So the people of China, you should be grateful for the ruling party, the CCP. Right? And for international audience, is if you want to get global problem resolved, you should come to China. China is a global platform for global problems to be solved. Right? So that enhances legitimacy of the ruling party. That's a second image I think Beijing wants to be projected. And the third one, I think, is also critical. I think China and Beijing wants to project the leader, President Xi, as a source of both stability and global leadership. And I think that's bigger than one summitry. China has been spending years in the past decade under President Xi's leadership for the global frameworks of global leadership, global development initiative, security initiative, global civilizational initiative. And now it has more language and narratives around global peace, prosperity, and shared modernization. I think the underlying theme is that China is not rising within the existing order, but China is trying to help the order to evolve. And I have noticed that Fukuyama's video has becoming popular, that China is not really within the narrative of the end of the history. However, China is trying to end the narrative of the end of history. So I think Beijing is trying to project that Xi is not only being seen as the leader of China, but a steward of stability in an increasingly disorderly world. I think those three projections of image of China, of China's leader, is what China is trying to get out of this for both domestic and international audience.
Fantastic insight. I think follow-up question on that. From Beijing's perspective, would this be considered a successful summit?
I think so. It has accomplished that three goals, as I just mentioned, to project images.
And follow-up question on that. What does Beijing expect from Washington in return, given, President Trump's approach to policymaking, which, as you know, pretty volatile and seems to have a concerned Beijing leadership?
One thing is to really personalize the mechanisms of dealing with both US and China underneath President Trump and President Xi. I think currently Secretary of Treasury Besson and Vice Premier He Lifeng has relatively stabilized and functional relationship. If that can be more stable between, for example, Secretary Marco Rubio and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and even underneath them, as CCS produces paper by our fellow Brendan Kelly and Scott Schell, and thanks to Wendy for helping on that, then the overall relationship can be actually more stabilized. I think that's what Beijing would like to see.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Danny, let me bring you out of your vacation, bring you into policymaking world to zoom us out a little bit. As you know, this bilateral relationship between the United States and China is just so crowded. Almost every issue seems to be, dragging five others in with it, with Taiwan, Ukraine, Iran, energy security, ally relationships, tech competition, broader balance of power across the globe. So I'm going to start with Iran. Was anything meaningful achieved at the summit in terms of addressing the current situation? I mean, the readout from both sides are quite different. Your take on that?
Yes, Lizzie, the readouts were quite different, and I think that kind of answers the question. Trump's claim about a common view between him and Xi Jinping on Iran not being allowed to have nuclear weapons or reopening the Strait of Hormuz is credible in the sense that this tracks with Chinese positions, but to stretch that to try to claim there's a real alignment of views, I think is overreach. I mean, just you mentioned North Korea also before, and what I'd like to point out is that building on Jing's point about image and diplomacy, Xi Jinping's about to visit Pyongyang. This is the first visit to North Korea by a Chinese leader in something like 20 years. This has been in the past a very testy relationship, but more to the point, the Iranian foreign minister came to Beijing and held meetings shortly before President Trump visited. As Orville described, Vladimir Putin's advanced plane was on the tarmac as Air Force One was departing. And now you've got Xi Jinping going to visit Kim Jong-un. So there's this juxtaposition of stabilization, tactical stabilization with Washington, while consolidating ties with these anti-US revisionist partners, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So the idea that China is going to partner with the United States, in effect, against Iran, I think is utterly groundless, even though rhetorically there's some overlap in the stated desire to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, restore the free flow of energy, which of course is hugely important to China.
Fantastic. And on Taiwan, lots of folks are focusing on President Trump's approach to Taiwan. I mean, he's at least public statement has certainly raised a lot of concerns in recent interview. He has talked about speaking with President Lai, making a decision on arms sales soon, and also this claim that Taiwan stole America's chip industry, very controversial. What do you think was actually discussed, achieved, or agreed upon on Taiwan between the two leaders, if anything?
It's very hard to say. I think that clearly President Trump had been warned extensively by his staff that uh, his critics were poised to pounce if he used a formula like opposing independence, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the big takeaway was that, as I mentioned earlier, you see the degree to which President Trump is echoing what he heard from President Xi Jinping, using Chinese formulas to put essentially the blame on Taiwan for destabilizing the region and potentially threatening U.S.-China condominium, and ignoring, as far as we can tell, entirely Beijing's coercive pressure against Taiwan. And I think when you look at the regional reaction, I'd say Tokyo and Seoul in particular, not surprisingly, were rattled by Trump's Taiwan comments, because it wasn't just a matter of terminology. His comments indicated plainly to them that even core security commitments by the United States are now up for negotiation. That there's, this transactional subordination of commitments to American interests with China, along with that, to them, very shocking shift in approach from deterring Beijing to deterring Taipei. If Washington is pressuring its partners to exercise restraint instead of putting the onus on China, then for Japan, for the Philippines, safeguarding their territorial integrity suddenly becomes much more difficult. And so my prediction is that we are going to see the hedging trend by American allies really move into overdrive.
Fantastic. And on the Asia Pacific allies point, I'm wondering, are they reassured somehow that there are still institutional constraints here in the United States to prevent a drastic change in existing Taiwan policy? Or are they nervous that Washington and Beijing might start making real deals over everyone else's heads with so much of the diplomacy centered on leadership dynamics?
I don't think that they would use the word might. I think that they believe that they witnessed the US and China beginning to certainly hold discussions and make deals that are based on the self-interest of the United States and Beijing, that profoundly affect the interests of these other countries, but give these other countries absolutely no say in the policy outcomes. Look, there's real anxiety that the Trump administration prioritizes tactical deal making with Beijing over alliances, over even long-term U.S. strategic positioning. And also, I think, great concern that the U.S. isn't standing up for the kind of rules or international institutions that it used to defend and that smaller countries depend on as protection or insulation against coercion. So I think that, of course, there are variations of views within Asia, which is a big place, and within the countries themselves. But fundamentally, even though the top line in Asia is relief that the two big powers are talking rather than fighting, that there's a pause in escalation, all governments are hungry for stability. They all want to reduce the risk of or the ongoing economic disruption and so on. But I think under that, there are many, many layers of serious anxiety. And you've got one set in the alliance partners that I mentioned. I won't presume to talk about Australia and the presence of the prime minister. But then you've also got Southeast Asia, which is different to some degree, and we can go into it if you want. But I think that whether it's Southeast Asia's bamboo diplomacy or alliance hedging, this summit sent shockwaves throughout the region.
Fantastic point. Turning to Orville, please take us into the long arc of U.S.-China summit. I mean, there's always a theatrical element to this summit, but help us decode the political theater surrounding this Trump-Xi summit. What struck you as important in terms of how the summit was staged and presented to the public?
Well, of course, with Donald Trump, there is always a lot of theater. And I think it's part of what makes the summit so interesting. It's also rather unpredictable. And I think that grows out of the reality that, in fact, President Trump has within him, over the sort of arc of his own relationship with China, a very large contradiction. On the one hand, he has genes that code for hawkishness, anti-communism. We saw those expressed in the first administration. On the other hand, I think he has this sense that he has a kind of almost magical power as a leader to sort of melt other leaders to do his bidding. That he can somehow be that persuasive. But I think Xi Jinping is a very tough subject for him she doesn't melt easily. And I think we have to remember, actually, that this relationship has not only gotten competitive, but it has really gotten to weaponize almost every channel of interaction as a choke point. I mean, we're living in the world of choke points. And strangely, I think it was rather shocking because Xi Jinping early in the summit lofted the question of Taiwan and said it was an important issue. And if not handled carefully, we might have conflict. And then it sort of went off the table for the next 2 days. It didn't sort of disrupt the rest of the sort of friendly banter and the good theatrics of the summit. But then it came back like a raging storm in Air Force One as soon as Trump had taken off. And he said, well, I don't know about arms sales. It's a good card to play. In other words, he said, it is a choke point. In other words, even Taiwan now has become a chokehold. So I think we have to remember that we have drifted off into this very contentious world where we're not only have foreign policy played out on one side of the ledger and trade is played out on the other, but trade and, in fact, every other aspect of the relationship now is subject to being being weaponized and used as a political lever. And that isn't a very easy state of affairs to turn around, even with all these grand pronunciamentos, about new frameworks. The framework still exists of contentious competition where you use rare earth, silicon, battery technology, you name it. Taiwan, everything has now turned into a chokehold.
Fantastic point on chokehold, which I think is at the center of a lot of the tensions between U.S. and China today, and fundamentally quite different from the previous, periods of U.S.-China relations. But speaking of positioning this summit historically, coming from your view as a historian, President Trump is calling it historic, and Beijing, as Jing mentioned, is also using very elevated language to describe the significance of this summit. So how real is that? And compared with the previous leadership summit, right? So Nixon, Mao Zedong, Reagan, Deng Xiaoping, and then Clinton and Jiang Zemin, you had front seat row there, and Obama and Xi Jinping and Trump and Xi Jinping during his first term. How does this summit compare?
Well, I think there's tremendous nostalgia, and there always has been, for 1972. When President Nixon and Henry Kissinger went to China, and they actually did change the terms of the game. And I think ever since then, every president has sort of aspired somehow, but not quite sure quite how to reach that same state of dramatic diplomatic breakthrough. And I think that it was sort of the subtext too of this summit. That Trump thought he had that capacity, that he could sort of bend the metal of Xi Jinping into some new framework. Well, it didn't work out. First of all, Marco Rubio is not Kissinger, and Trump is not Nixon, and Kissinger and Zhou Enlai had a very, I think, alchemic relationship. There was actually deep respect between them. So they succeeded in doing that. So I think, everybody sort of runs up against this wall. Can we really change the fundamental nature of this relationship? And I think, Xi thinks he can change the fundamental nature of Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un. I mean, he's had a crack at all of these people, and he has failed. And so this, I think, in a certain sense, this gets us to the question of big leader culture. We are in a world where countries are led by big leaders. Who they are, what they want, what their fundamental nature is important. And I think, Trump thought he could kind of just bro it out with Xi Jinping. But I think it didn't happen. There are too many sort of fundamental contradictions. And they are what Mao Zedong would have called antagonistic contradictions, which means they cannot be solved easily by just some chatter. They're deep within the system, and they're very often only able to be solved by struggle and violence. So I think all of this sort of lurks beneath the surface of the bromides and the bonhomie and the nice aspirational talk that we witnessed over the last couple of days on this summit. And I think it's going to be very difficult for even the greatest diplomat to untie that. And I'm not so sure we made much progress in Beijing in this past summit.
Thank you so much, Orville. Kevin, speaking of managing a tough relations, you've spent years thinking about managing strategic competition and guardrails between the United States and China, arguably the most important and also the most thorny bilateral relationship to manage and think about. But I would argue, as Orville alluded to, I think we're now in an even harder environment. President Trump 2.0, Xi Jinping with more concentrated power, and the tech competition landscape a lot more sophisticated than before and highly securitized. And the global order itself, much more fragmented, much more contested. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit to ask you, do you think this managed competition framework you laid out in your book and your related writing is still the pragmatic or the right framework to think about US-China relations? Or are we moving into something much more transactional, much more chokehold based, as Orville talked about, and much more leadership driven?
I think where I'd partly disagree with Orville and Danny on the question of the utility, effectiveness in the real world of frameworks is along these lines. I think Orville used the marvelous term before, which I've never heard, an enunciamento. I think we should have a seminar on enunciamentos, Orville. Bromides, and Danny bringing a certain Brooklyn touch to it, said coffee mugs. So I think we should be producing Asia Society coffee mugs with Chinese characters on the side, which says constructive strategic stability, and we can have a competition among ourselves in terms of what actually that means. We could have English language coffee mugs and Chinese language ones. My comment is along these lines about conceptual frameworks for relationships at the international level between great powers. One, the premise both in Washington and in Beijing remains deeply realist. This is, in reality, a strategic competition. It doesn't matter what it is called at the end of the day. although that has an effect on what actors and diplomats do, the underlying reality is that there's a competition, and that China, within that competition, wishes to replace the United States as the dominant country against the matrices of power in East Asia, West Pacific, across the Indo-Pacific, and arguably globally. So that is just the underlying strategic reality. And the United States, through its systems, both Republican and Democrat, have understood that for the better part of the last decade. Second, on the question of the nomenclature or the framing language for this strategic competition, what I find relevant and important about it are the following 2 to 3 things. A, the Chinese side have felt confident enough to change the formulation from the past, to change from a formulation which in the past pretended that there was no strategic competition, a formulation in the past which said it was in fact the halcyon days of win-win, and that the only thing standing in the road of win-win was a bunch of reactionaries in the United States incapable of recognizing where the wins actually lay. And instead, they've had the self-confidence to move on to the point, strategic and political self-confidence to move on to the point of saying, yep, this is a competition. And by the way, to sharpen this up a bit, I'm going to intensify my language on Taiwan in terms of the strategic red lines component of the competition. B, I'm no longer going to pretend that this is all win-win. It's not. That's actually a shift. And for me, that represents not just a shift in tonality, it represents a shift in internal communication by the Chinese to their entire system and to the world. I think the other element of this framing that I would emphasize in terms of its intrinsic significance as opposed to its bromide level irrelevance is along these lines. Xi Jinping, both for the rest of 26 and through to the 21st Party Congress at the end of 27, would like to use this framework to induce maximum stability in the relationship with the United States. He is utterly realist about what that means, but if he could have an arrangement which reduces the risk of further unilateral tariff hikes, reduces the risk of unilateral and new and additional changes to the export control regime on technology, and if it reduces the risk from his perspective of further arms shipments to Taiwan, then he's going to double down on this stabilization mechanism with Washington in order to achieve those utterly realist objectives. And the third thing I'd say about the nomenclature here, Lizzie, is as follows. You look carefully at the subtext of what was reflected in the Beijing official media, and that is that this new relationship of constructive strategic stability will be driven at the leader level, leadership level diplomacy. It's not, as just Jing said before, what's called in Chinese 主场外交, home court advantage, bringing everyone to Beijing. In the grand old days of tributary states, as everyone came to Beijing to pay honor to the leader, there's an element of that. But in addition to that, there is the fact that I, Xi Jinping, will drive this relationship at a personal level with Donald Trump in order to achieve the realist objectives that I ran through before within this new self-confident formulation, which the Chinese have now embraced as an openly competitive relationship. The one caveat to this, Lizzie, and I'll close on this point, is as follows, that when asked at the end of the visit, I think by Brett Baer in his Fox interview with the President Trump, that is, what was the most important outcome of the, that's our cat scratching on something, by the way, if you can hear it. What was the most important outcome of the visit? The president said the relationship with President Xi Jinping. and it was all about the relationship. Now, President Xi at one level will be entirely pleased by that response. At a different level, though, for those of us who are students of a Marxist-Leninist system, personal relationships at the end of the day do not count for a whole lot. And if you were to look at who President Xi has as a leader with whom he has something approaching a personal relationship based on the surround sound and what we know from their encounters in the past, it's with Vladimir Putin. And that's been said on a number of occasions. So the reason I have said all of that, Lizzie, in terms of managed strategic competition, is the dial has changed in terms of the framing. It is not just in my judgment at least, a set of bromides from the Chinese perspective. It reflects some substantive new elements. A, I'm now self-confident. B, I'd like some stability for the next year and a half, thank you very much. And C, whatever the other elements in the system in the United States may be saying, I'll be driving this with President Trump to achieve those objectives. And I think being mindful of that, and particularly the trajectory into Taiwan for 2028, and so it's time we should discuss that before the end of our discussion now, then I think these things can't be, shall I say, underemphasized.
Yeah, before we turn to the critical Taiwan question, one follow-up on the dynamics of this new 元首外交, leader-driven diplomacy. Would you say this crisis management mode, depending increasingly on the two leaders, is beneficial or is it harmful for the world's two most consequential powers to impose discipline on the relationship? I can see it either way. On the one hand, Xi has more concentrated power than previous leaders, potentially more say on the bilateral relationship. But on the other hand, also strikes me as a highly fragile model to manage bilateral relations.
Well, you don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar to work out how the Chinese system works historically, but also contemporaneously. Historically, for example, when the Chinese decide on a new formulation like the one we've been debating this morning about constructive strategic stability, that doesn't just pop out the end of a couple of beers at Zhongnanhai of a weekend. It's the product of some intensive work across the system on which the leader signs off and will have been contributing to, while recognizing the fact that he will be the interpreter of this framework, okay, in terms of the real world of diplomacy. But he plus an utterly institutionalized discipline behind his leadership as well. And President Trump's approach to leadership, as we know, is much more maverick, is much more individualized, and is therefore much more personalized. So where does this therefore land in terms of the real world at the first test of this, which will be September 24 in Washington, D.C., is impossible at this stage to predict. The purpose of my presentation this morning has been the Chinese shift in the framing of this relationship at head of state-driven diplomacy, leader-level-driven diplomacy, is that it reflects greater and greater levels of Chinese self-confidence. And Taiwan, if you want to touch on that, because I'm mindful of the clock, just one comment from me, is looking carefully and staring into the tea leaves about new Chinese public language on Taiwan in the context of this visit, plus what we see in the surrounding environment in terms of China's own military preparations over a long period of time. I don't think it is probable or even possible that we will see any unilateral military action by China over Taiwan this side of the 21st Party Congress at the end of 27. I think it's a much more open question what happens in calendar year 28, where you have not just the 21st Congress out of your way in November, but you have the critical event, which is the January 28 Taiwanese presidential election. And Lai Ching-te, who's the Taiwanese president, is up for re-election. Danny has already referred to Lai Ching-te being mentioned in recent dispatches by the President of the United States, if the Taiwanese people vote again for the DPP, we could there find our way into a serious final year of the Trump administration Taiwan crisis. And I think we should not underestimate that risk. Not probable, but I would say with an advanced level of possibility.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kevin. Picking up on Kevin's point, look ahead a little bit. Let me just close by pulling together a few threads in our discussion. Quick takes from each of you. What should we expect between now to 2028, but also now in December, especially, now in September, especially with President Xi Jinping's return visit now confirmed by both sides? And what do you think are the biggest risks of backsliding? Please just jump in with your thoughts.
I've already said too much. 30 seconds from me is simply this. Apart from everything I've just reflected on frameworks and on the Taiwan question, let's focus with a laser idea on what happens in the real world, on guardrails, on AI models. And I would pay tribute to Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent for his work in getting that onto the central agenda of this relationship. Open question, where does it land? Back to you, Lizzie, and to the team.
Fantastic. Wendy, Jing, Jenny.
So just a comment from me. What I'm going to be also watching, I think this détente, frankly, is very fragile. And even leading up to the summit meeting, it was very interesting. China unfolded some of the most onerous supply chain restrictions ever published, and the US didn't even respond. And I think they were just kind of testing the limits. And I think the US is also testing the limits. And I suspect that a lot of different government agencies in Washington have been told, don't do anything until the summit happens. And the question will be, will this new stability somehow, will we turn off these measures, or will both sides keep testing this détente? And as we've seen in the past, there are always kind of unexpected things that could turn this relationship south. But we clearly have new avenues for engagement. And again, with up to 3 leader-level meetings this year, there will be a lot of opportunities, again, to either build on what we've done so far, but also to prevent things from spoiling this newfound truce.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Wendy. And Danny, Orville, Jing, please jump in for final thoughts.
Sure. I'd just point out that when you think about September, this is a period of maximum political vulnerability for President Trump, given the US midterms. And I think that means, and the Chinese are well aware, that he's going to be willing to pay retail prices for the sorts of things from China that served his political advantage on November 3rd. Kevin has accurately pointed out not only the significance of the 21st Party Congress 2027, but of the 28 presidential elections on Taiwan, as well as the upcoming midterm elections on Taiwan. And I think that for Beijing, this visit has strengthened its core narrative regarding Taiwan, that the pro-independence DPP risks dragging Taiwan into a war, and that the election, both midterm and certainly the presidential election, should be a referendum on which party can keep Taiwan out of conflict.
Fantastic. Orville and Jing, any concluding thoughts to close us out?
Jing, go ahead.
Thank you, Orville. I think just 2 quick points. One is under the framework of constructive strategic stability. There are actually 4 lines, and the number 1 is collaboration as a mainstream to stabilize. We haven't really touched on too much on the collaboration or cooperation. I think Kevin alluded to the AI guardrail. Hopefully that will be something, as I mentioned in the beginning, as one of the deliverables, and hopefully health can be something else in either the cure for cancer front we have been working on for years, but also on mental health or something else. I think both the mechanisms of implementation and deliverables is something, hopefully there will be things to help to stabilize, because something I hope will go beyond competition, that is, again, for the betterment of humanity.
Orville, please.
Well, and yet, I have to say, it is not for a lack of areas of common interest that we've not been able to collaborate. I mean, we've had climate change, we've had pandemics, we've had health, now we have AI. I mean, there are myriad areas where we could very logically collaborate and should have collaborated, but alas, we really have not. And so I think it's going to be a very heavy lift for us to sort of turn this sort of super tanker direction around, which presupposes a fundamentally hostile relationship between the two countries, which needs restraint, constriction, management, control, punitive actions. I will watch with great hopefulness and great attention for the first area where the United States and China, in this new framework, are capable of really getting together to collaborate. And in any collaboration, it involves giving something to get something. And that paradigm, I don't think, has been well exercised of late.
Thank you so much, Orville. Well, good to know we don't have a supreme leader monopolizing over Asian society's point of views. We have a range of different views on different takes and equally insightful analysis of the summit. My thanks to Kevin Rodd, Wendy Cutler, Danny Russel, Orville Schell, and Jing Qian, our heavyweight panel across generations of Asian society experts. And thank you for all our audience for joining this episode of our Asian Society webinar. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Until next time.